Welcome. I'm Karen Chance-McCurious, the Director of Alumni Relations at Harvard Law School, and I'll be your host for today's session. Today I'm delighted to welcome our featured speaker, Professor Kristen Stilt. Kristen A. Stilt is Professor of Law and a Director of the Islamic Legal Studies Program and Faculty Director of the new Animal Law and Policy Program. Professor Stilt's research focuses on Islamic law and society in both historical and contemporary contexts. She was named a Carnegie Scholar for her work on constitutional Islam, and in 2013 was awarded a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship. She has also received awards from Fulbright and Fulbright Hayes. Professor Stilt holds a JD from the University of Texas and a PhD from Harvard University in History and Middle Eastern Studies. All participants in today's HLeX open lecture will have the opportunity to submit questions. Please use the questions panel on your screen at any time during the presentation. We will be addressing questions at the end of the presentation. Professor Stilt, welcome.
Thank you so much, Karen, and everyone here in the Alumni Office for this opportunity to talk about the new Animal Law and Policy Program here at HLS. And thank all of you for joining me during the middle of your day or whatever time that might be wherever you are. I really appreciate your taking the time out, especially at this really busy time of the year. So as Karen mentioned, I'm still fairly new to HLS, and so is the Animal Law and Policy Program that I'll be talking about today. I created the program just as I was arriving at Harvard in 2014, thanks to the support of many people whom I will talk about in my presentation. So with this exciting new program, what I want to talk to you about today is a little bit about the history of animal law at Harvard, which predates the program by quite a bit of time, and then turn to the work that's happening under the program's auspices, including some of my own research, and I'll end with that, with my own work. We very much want to hear from you and take your questions, and so I'll aim to finish my part in about 30 minutes. And please use your questions panel on your screen to ask questions at any time, and Karen will collect them at the end. So a new century of animal law. Well, that implies that there was an old century, and in fact, there were several. So we could start this historical introduction with the 1641 Massachusetts Bay Colony Law, prohibiting any tyranny or cruelty towards any brute creatures, which are usually kept for the use of man, and that's how they spelled things at that time. But we could also begin a little bit later, in 1836, when the Massachusetts legislature enacted a law providing for up to 1 year of incarceration for cruelly beating or torturing any animal. So we see that animal law has a long lineage, not only in the U.S., but in Massachusetts as well. Now, closer to home, we actually have a Harvard Law School connection with animal law at a very early stage. So George Thorndike Angell, who graduated from Harvard Law School in 1850, has a deep connection. He founded the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, one of the nation's first animal protection organizations, and worked very hard on not only laws in Massachusetts, but around the country and around the world. And let's just take a look at his quote. "I am sometimes asked, why do you spend so much of your time and money talking about kindness to animals when there is so much cruelty to men? I answer, I'm working at the roots." And that's a very interesting concept. And his thought was that society is denigrated and society suffers when we are cruel to innocent creatures, to creatures who are weak, who are within our control. And so he focused on anti-cruelty in part because I do think he was concerned with animals, but also in large part because he was worried about society and the ill effects on society. And that sort of notion that there's a link between doing bad things to animals and harming society or even harming humans is something that's now been studied by psychologists and underpins a fair amount of anti-cruelty legislation in the U.S. today. So let's move on to something more recent in time. Harvard Law School's first animal law course, which started in the spring of 2000, long before my arrival here. At that time, Harvard was one of the first schools to offer a course in animal law, and now over 163 U.S. law schools have offered the class. And here we have Steve Wise, who taught that first class, and here he is on the right, back at Harvard Law School giving a talk more recently about his new work for the Non-Human Rights Project. And you may have heard about that. It's gained a fair amount of media attention, with a new documentary, Unlocking the Cage, that is just being released now. So we're grateful for Steve for kicking off animal law at Harvard Law School long before my arrival. Bob Barker subsequently made a major gift in 2001 to establish the Bob Barker Endowment for the Study of Animal Rights at Harvard Law School. And if you're not sure, yes, it's that Bob Barker of The Price is Right fame, who throughout his career, but especially in later years, developed a strong interest in animals and dedicated a substantial amount of money and gave money not only to Harvard Law School, but to several others over time. All right. Now let's move on a little bit to my arrival in the creation of the program. So just as I was arriving, a new gift from Brad Goldberg allowed us to create the Animal Law and Policy Program just in the fall of 2014, along with my arrival. And we thank David Wolfson, who's a partner at Millbank, for helping facilitate this. And then with the 2015 edition of Chris Green as Executive Director, who you saw earlier, standing there next to Bob Barker, with Chris's arrival in 2015, we're now a full-fledged research program. And I guess the proof of that is that we have a website. So we are now part of the research programs at Harvard Law School, of which there are many, and you've heard about some of them in previous HLeX presentations. So just to say a little bit more then about what we're doing, about our areas of mission, there's really three main elements: expanding educational opportunities, increasing the quality and quantity of academic research in the field, and informing and educating broader communities. Let me just say something briefly about each one. Expanding educational opportunities is not just for our students, our current students, although that's a large part of it. We are adding new courses. We've added a wildlife course that I'll say a little more about later. We're adding a farmed animal welfare course. I teach an introduction to animal law course and hope to expand to a comparative and international animal law course. So that's definitely one of the important parts of our mission, as well as helping students pursue their educational development outside of the classroom through externships, through other experiential opportunities, supporting them in the summers as they do internships. So educational opportunities overall. The research in the field is really crucial because this is a new field. You heard about the field of food law in a previous presentation some months ago, and like food law, animal law is a fairly new area of academic scholarship, and there's a lot of work to be done to try to incentivize, to promote, to help make people work on new and interesting topics, and to do so at high academic standards. And then third, informing and educating broader communities. We have a tremendous mission that includes going beyond the confines of Harvard Law School, beyond the campus, and speaking to alums, people like you listening, as well as the community, and getting our word out and being a player in the field of animal law and policy writ large. So how are we doing that? Well, Harvard University is really helping us with our mission, and one of the first pieces of writing within the Harvard publication family that came out is this really fantastic article called Are Animals Things? And as alums, you get the Harvard magazine, so you might have seen this. I want to just talk for a second about it because it was not only a fantastic article in terms of profiling the program, but it talked about a very interesting and important substantive area of the law, which is, are animals things? Are they property? The article opens with a discussion of a case that I teach in both my animal law class and my property law class, Strickland v. Medlin, a recent Texas Supreme Court decision. Let me just read to you the opening paragraphs. I think they're really gripping, but and also highlights one of the most salient questions when talking about the place of animals in the legal system. So let me just read to you from the opening paragraphs. Jeremy and Catherine Medlin have 2 children, but with 8-year-old Avery around, it often felt like 3. A beloved mixed breed mutt with flopped forward Labrador ears, Avery was a member of the family, welcome on the couch, included on vacations, a fixture in family photos. But in June 2009, the dog spooked at a thunderclap and fled the Medlins' Fort Worth, Texas backyard. He ended up at a nearby shelter, where his overjoyed owners found him the following day. They lacked the cash to pay the required fees, however, so a hold for owner tag was placed on Avery's cage until their return. But when Jeremy Medlin arrived with the cash and his 2 children in tow, their pet had disappeared. Somehow, there'd been a mix-up. Avery had been put to sleep. Devastated by the loss, the Medlins brought a lawsuit seeking damages for Avery's sentimental value from the shelter worker who'd made the tragic mistake. But in the Lone Star State, they learned, loss of companionship damages were available only for human plaintiffs who'd lost close human family members. And in the eyes of American law, animals are considered property. And in Texas, this entitled the Medlins only to their property's market value. As an 8-year-old mutt, Avery had virtually no value at all, and the case was dismissed. The article goes on to talk about the fact that there was precedent in Texas for awarding damages for sentimental value of property, the so-called heirloom cases. Jewelry, pistols, handmade bedspreads, your grandmother's wedding dress. When property like that is negligently damaged in Texas, individuals can recover some sentimental value because the market value is very low. It doesn't completely measure or compensate them for the loss. And what did the Supreme Court say about that? Let me quote again from the article. Animals were property, the Supreme Court ruled, but they were not like other types of property. Although an heirloom is sentimental, an owner's attachment to a beloved pet is more. It is emotional, based on the rich companionship it provides, the court found, and cannot be shoehorned into keepsake-like sentimentality for litigation purposes. And I'll read you the closing paragraph of the introduction of her article. The Medlins were stunned. If this were true, they argued, one could seek sentimental damages for the destruction of a taxidermied pet deemed an heirloom, but not for a euthanized animal. Furthermore, it trapped them in a catch-22. Loss of companionship damages were not available because Avery wasn't human. Yet the court also said that pets offered such rich companionship that they cannot be treated like things. It left the Medlins wondering, did property law apply to animals or didn't it? Was a lost heirloom, an inanimate thing, really more emotionally valuable than their beloved pet? And why, if judges believed an animal to be a special kind of property, not a fungible and animate object like, say, a toaster, as the court wrote, why was the law still so unclear? So I encourage you to take a look at that article because this is one of the fundamental questions in animal law. Animals are property, and what does that mean in terms of improving their treatment, and even what rights might they be due? So returning back to the present, the Harvard Law School website picked up the image, and we were thrilled to be on the front page for quite some time. And then, garnering more and more attention for the program's burgeoning development, a new donor came on board just recently. Putting his money where his mouth is the way we announced a new gift just last month. where Jeff Thomas made a recent gift of $1 million and a subsequent matching gift of $500,000 to support individual donations of up to $50,000 through the end of 2016. And putting his money where his mouth is the title of the announcement, because he talks initially about his own journey to become a vegetarian. The funds will enable us to increase attention to farmed animals in particular, so we're very excited about that. But I also want to point out how much institutional support has come along with the program's growth. So in the announcement, President Faust said, the Jeffrey Thomas Fund will support the critically important work of the Animal Law and Policy Program. I look forward to seeing how it will advance research and teaching to improve the welfare for animals, as well as our own dean, how humans raise animals for food in this country and around the world affects animal welfare, human health, food safety, workers' rights, as well as climate change and the environment. With the leadership of the Animal Law and Policy Program and the marvelous generosity of Jeff Thomas, Harvard Law School pursues scholarship and work at the forefront of these critical concerns, and I am so grateful. Right. So in the new century of animal law, let me hold that just for 1 second. In the new century of animal law, the program is charting an ambitious path forward. Echoing what the Dean said in her press release, we are concerned with all of the ways in which the treatment of animals matters to the animals themselves, and also with the deep interconnections between the treatment of animals and the environment, human health and safety, including food law and human rights, and our reach is global, with synergies to my own area of expertise regionally in the Middle East and the Muslim world. So what are we doing to tackle all of these incredibly important questions? Well, one of the ways is to expand the scope of our teaching, as I mentioned, and we recently brought into the program John Lovorn, Senior Vice President and Chief Counsel for Animal Protection Litigation at the Humane Society of the U.S., to teach a wildlife class and to support his own scholarly work at the intersection of environmental law and animal law. So what is that intersection? Let's take a look at this. Livestock's Long Shadow, a 2006 UN Food and Agriculture Organization report. The UN report shows the, quote, very substantial contribution of animal agriculture to climate change and air pollution, to land, soil, and water degradation, and to the reduction of biodiversity. Now that image on the left might look beautiful, maybe artistic from the sky, and I can't ask you to guess what it is because I can't wait for you to tell me in the question panel. That's a feedlot. And all those tiny dots that you can barely see on the left side in the grid are cattle. And what's on the right, it's a manure lagoon. So the production of cattle for food, and the same is true for chickens or pigs, produces a substantial amount of waste, and that's what's draining into the right, and that is the environmental toll. The environmental toll on animals and on humans is even greater than this, and this is where John's work is really fascinating. Right? So this contributes methane, which is a greenhouse gas, contributing to global warming, to climate change, whatever you prefer to call it. That is a substantial problem for everyone on the planet. But as John's work shows, look what it's doing to wild animal loss. Okay. So this is a chart showing annual human-caused mortality. Looking at animals globally, and again, this is John Lovorn's research, who we brought here to teach wildlife law. Animal agriculture on the right is a massive cause of animal death because, of course, the animals are brought into the world in order to be killed. But look what climate change is doing to animal death too. Through global warming, the effects on wildlife in particular are devastating. And as John argues, he thinks the devastation to wildlife is a harbinger of what's going to happen to human populations. So just to put it into focus, things that we talk about and care a lot about, trophy hunting, animal research, wildlife trafficking, the mortality from those causes pales in comparison to the mortality upon wild animals from climate change. And of course, animal agriculture is what is contributing to this. So it's a double threat. This is not just a question of animals. It's also a matter of human rights. Mary Robinson, LLM 68 and former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, was at Harvard Law School this fall to talk about climate change and human impacts. And let's look at her quote and I'll tell you more about what she said. "We need each of us to think about our carbon footprint. Eat less meat or no meat at all. Let's commit to the Paris Agreement. Let's commit to leave no one behind." So Mary Robinson, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who has seen, I would imagine, almost every wrong that can happen against humanity in the world, is now working on climate justice with her new foundation. Her talk here was gripping, and there was recently a Harvard Gazette article that's actually Harvard Law Today that summarized it, and if this is an area of interest to you, I would encourage you to take a look at that. She talked about the human rights impact of climate change, climate refugees, and they're not only out there, they're also in the U.S. And the Harvard Law Today article talks about some of the case studies she went over in some closed-door sessions with the Human Rights Program, in which case climate change is real and it's happening in America, as well as, of course, around the world. And one comment from a representative from Human Rights Watch that also really stuck with me is he said, he pointed out that they're actually seeing an increase in the number of girls who are married at a young age in Bangladesh, and they believe the reason is that climate change has disrupted patterns of agriculture such that families who are living on the edge of subsistence are even in greater threat, and as a result are marrying off their daughters earlier because they simply can't afford to keep them at home. So to think about the reach of climate change is very important, and then to bring it back around to what's the animal law perspective. And the animal law's perspective is really front and center and crucial to the fight on climate change. So moving to something closer to home is the Massachusetts ballot initiative. And for those of you who vote in the state, you'll remember Yes on 3 in this past election. The measure prohibits certain types of farm animal confinement and bans the sale of products derived from such practices. Just to put that into context, what the measure does now is requires that in the state of Massachusetts, producers of farmed animals have to give their chickens, veal calves, and cows who have given birth more space, their ability to stand up, turn around, essentially pushing at the walls of the current factory farm model. And it's not just about the producers in the U.S. either, and in Massachusetts either. It's anyone selling products in Massachusetts have to comply with these new guidelines. Now, this, of course, was framed as an animal cruelty question, but it's also about consumers, because the link between the factory farm model and consumers is very real and tangible, ranging from one of the obvious things is that when you confine animals in such tight spaces, disease not only develops but transmits very rapidly, requiring use of antibiotics as a preventive matter. That's not good for consumer health. But we can also even tie this back to the climate change conversation we just had. More animals means more production of waste, which means more methane. Right? If animals are kept in a somewhat more natural environment, giving them a little bit more space, right, we might think about what that's going to do to people's beliefs about animals, to their consumption of animals. It'll be very interesting to see how this affects consumer beliefs and purchasing patterns going forward. All right, let's turn a little bit now back to the program. I've given you a bit of an overview of animal law in the world, animal law at Harvard, some of the big picture issues we're working on. Let me bring us to events here at home, right here in the law school. I also want to remind you to be asking questions. Use the questions panel on the screen, and Karen will be collecting those so we can have a discussion at the end. So I want to say something about another quote about the ballot measure before we move on. This is from our Executive Director, Chris Green, who I mentioned earlier. The Massachusetts ballot measure is poised to be the single most progressive piece of farmed animal protection legislation ever passed in the U.S. Having this happen in our own backyard, right as our program gets off the ground, has allowed us to analyze the process in the classroom and give our students the opportunity to gain invaluable experience working directly on the campaign. So I certainly teach the ballot initiative in class, and many of our students volunteered in the collection of signatures necessary to get the initiative on the ballot, and I think they learned quite a lot in the process. The question 3 ballot measure passed with 78% of voter support, and it's the largest margin of victory for any animal protection ballot measure ever attempted in the U.S. So I mentioned the students and their engagement. The students are very engaged in our program. The Student Animal Law chapter, which is called the Student Animal Legal Defense chapter, is incredibly active and engaged with the Animal Law and Policy program. They've worked on our research projects, they served as research assistants for me, as well as internships and externships for outside NGOs. The students are extremely active. They publish many articles in the HLS Record, the HLS newspaper, and they've hosted many speakers, panels, and films per year, at least 15, if not more. And these are not events for a small group of already interested students. Just to give you an example, Bruce Friedrich of the Good Food Institute was here. Their events at noon will typically pack or overflow a room, and here they have over 100 students. So the students are 100 or so students. The students are extremely interested. They're very active. I'm hoping that some of the recent graduates are listening to my talk today, and we'll jump in with questions. We're so thrilled to have so much student interest. And of course, at the Animal Law and Policy program, our strong relationship with the students has good synergies and allows us to reach and connect with students who might just drop in one day for a noontime talk, but that message they may take away into their own work, wherever it may be, the corporate world, the public sector, government service, and we feel like our working relationship with our students allows us to expand our reach exponentially, and we're very grateful to them. So just this past weekend, we hosted here a conference on the Animal Welfare Act at 50. So the Animal Welfare Act is a major piece of federal legislation founded initially 50 years ago, and we decided it was time to take a critical look at it to see what are the successes, what are the weaknesses. Okay. The AWA is the most comprehensive animal protection legislation in the United States and governs the treatment of hundreds of thousands of animals at over 15,000 locations across the nation, including zoos, circuses, marine parks, and facilities involved in the pet trade. As my colleague Cass Sunstein has written in a UCLA Law Review article called Standing for Animals, in terms of animal protection, by far the most important measure is the Animal Welfare Act, which imposes a wide range of negative constraints and affirmative duties on those who deal in or with animals. Also, his quote goes on, the AWA creates an incipient Bill of Rights for animals. Okay. The key provision of the statute requires the Secretary, and that's of the USDA, to issue standards to govern the humane handling, care, treatment, and transportation of animals by dealers, research facilities, and exhibitors. So that's really the entities who are covered. Pet dealers, research facilities, and exhibitors like zoos, SeaWorld, and the like. However, many Americans are surprised to learn that none of the 9 billion animals raised for food each year in this country are covered by the protections of the Animal Welfare Act. The same goes for the rats, mice, and birds who account for roughly 95% of all animals used in research. So our conversation over the weekend was about the successes and the failures of the Animal Welfare Act. Obviously, the fact that it exempts or fails to include so many animals that are used in the U.S. is problematic, but we also talked about ways in which, for what it does, it can be extremely beneficial and provide additional protections that didn't exist prior to the Act's adoption. I will say that one of the strengths of the conference, which drew over 250 participants, is that we were able to bring in a really wide range of speakers. And if this is of interest to you, we will have a full video library of the entire event up on the Animal Law and Policy Program's website at some point in the future, and you can certainly check back with us or send me an email and we'll let you know when it's there. But importantly, we were able to bring to Harvard not only lawyers who are litigating Animal Welfare Act cases and people who were involved in its founding. We also brought research scientists, the very ones whose lab involves research on animals, and their contributions were extremely important. We also were able to bring the chief administrator, the chief official at the U.S. Department of Agriculture responsible for the implementation of the Animal Welfare Act, as well as an official from the Department of Justice who also works in conjunction with the USDA. So we had a really wide range of individuals present and presenting, and it made for a very incredible event. But I want to highlight one speaker there who came to talk to us. To do that, let me just give you a little bit of background. Some of you might recall in 2015 an article in the New York Times, an expose of a facility called the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center in southern Nebraska. And the title of the article, U.S. Research Lab Lets Livestock Suffer in Quest for Profit. So before we get into the text, let me just set the stage for you. If you recall, I mentioned that farmed animals are excluded or not covered by the Animal Welfare Act. This is also true for farmed animals used in research for food production purposes. So if you have a pig in a lab who's there to test some kind of new medical device, that's covered. But a pig who's tested to increase the production of pork is not covered by the Animal Welfare Act. And so what this led to was a situation where there were scientists conducting experiments to enhance meat productivity unregulated by the Animal Welfare Act. And so I know your eyes have been drawn to the actual text, so just let's take a look at that for a second. At a remote research center on the Nebraska plains, scientists are using surgery and breeding techniques to re-engineer the farm animal to fit the needs of the 21st century meat industry. The potential benefits are huge. Animals that produce more offspring, yield more meat, and cost less to raise. There are, however, some complications. Pigs are having more piglets, up to 14, instead of the usual 8. But hundreds of these newborns, too frail or crowded to move, are being crushed each year when their mothers roll over. Cows, which normally bear one calf at a time, have been retooled to have twins and triplets, which often emerge weakened or deformed, dying in such numbers that even meat producers have been repulsed. And the article goes on to talk about other experiments, such as an effort to essentially reverse the domestication of sheep to create sheep that require no care when giving birth or out in the field, resulting in really the devastation of so many newborns, newborn lamb. But as I said, because the Animal Welfare Act does not cover farmed animals used in this context, there was no protection for them. And that meant that there was no scientific review board that had to assess their experiments. And the closing presentation of our conference was by the scientist, veterinarian Jim Keene, who was the whistleblower that enabled the New York Times expose to be written. He worked at this facility for many, many years, and slowly over time started to think that something wasn't right. And he spoke to us about his eventual switch from skeptic to whistleblower and what it meant for him, for his family, and what the results have been. So I urge you to read the New York Times article and then to come back to our website and listen to this amazing presentation by the whistleblower who made all of this happen. His takeaway for us on the Animal Welfare Act is it's not perfect, and that had become clear through the course of the weekend, but it really does matter in the sense he felt that if the experimentations had been subject to a scientific review committee, the review committee would have said, you can't do this. We know the answer. You cannot push science this far in an effort to re-engineer animals to produce more meat because the destruction on those animals is too great, and we already know that. You can't continue to try to experiment year after year. So finally, in our last few minutes, let me transition to a current research project of mine. So when Karen introduced me, she said that I'm not only the faculty director of the Animal Law and Policy program, but I'm one of the faculty directors of the Islamic Legal Studies program. And my own research focuses on comparative law. And so let me just finish with a short kind of overview of a project I'm working on. We're going to go from the plains of Nebraska to Tahrir Square and the Egyptian Revolution. So the 2011 revolution in Egypt leads to a new constitution. In fact, two constitutions. One that didn't last very long, and finally 2014, which is currently in place today. Animal advocates in Egypt had long tried to get an animal welfare law adopted under the authoritarian rule of President Hosni Mubarak, who was ousted in 2011, and they had never been successful. After the revolution, when there was a constitutional process that was supposed to be democratic and inclusive, they thought, let's appeal to the drafting commission. Why don't we try to get some recognition of animal welfare in the Constitution? And in the process, one particular advocate became a key figure, Amina Abaza, who worked tirelessly to appeal to the drafting commission. Interestingly, though, she initially didn't start talking about the protection of animals. Her advocacy in the constitutional process focused on some issues that are also near and dear to her heart: human rights, women's rights, and the rights of Christians in Egypt, which is a 90% Muslim society, and Christians have not always received equal treatment, whether under the law or in practice. She found herself giving speeches on the importance of women's rights in the new Constitution, human rights, and she almost found herself returning back to arguments she had made in her animal advocacy days about the link between abuse against animals and abuse against humans. The same link argument that George Angel made that I started the presentation with. She found her arguments were very well received. And to cut the story very short, she worked tirelessly, and this is the result. This is now Article 45 of the Egyptian Constitution. The state shall protect its seas, shores, lakes, waterways, and natural reserves. Trespassing, polluting, or misusing any of them is prohibited. Every citizen has the guaranteed right to enjoy them. The state will provide for the protection and development of green space in urban areas, the preservation of plant, livestock, and fish resources, the protection of endangered species and species threatened by extinction, and the kind treatment of animals, all according to law. So it's this last phrase, the kind treatment of animals, that was included due to her hard work. Interestingly, and you can read my article on this if this is appealing to you, you'll see that the kind treatment of animals is embedded here in a protection of otherwise really mostly about the environment. And the link between the protection of animals and the protection of the environment is a really important one. In America in particular, these movements are often seen as working at different issues. Animal interests on the individual animal, environmentalists working on the level of species, oftentimes with conflict, but for Amina Abaza and in the Egyptian context, they're seen as part and parcel of the same endeavor. And in fact, she and others had formed a shadow government because in Egypt, as in many places in the world, including America, women's interests are not well recognized at the level of government. And so the women's organizations formed a shadow government made up of women and one man with a common goal. And she's the Minister of Animal Welfare and the Environment. And they really do see the two as linked. And we would take, I think, an important lesson in the U.S. to see those two, the animals and the environment, is in a common cause. So finally, let me just say, my work on Egypt led me to ask the question, well, which other countries protect animals in the highest law of the land? It's a small but significant group. You see here India, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Slovenia, clustered in Europe, also Brazil, and of course Egypt. And so a current paper I have talks about why do we see animal protections in admittedly a small number of countries in the world, but I think that it's definitely growing. But just notice something about them. Yes, there's a cluster in Western Europe, although Slovenia was, formerly part of kind of the Soviet satellite world. But we're looking at the Northern Hemisphere, the Southern Hemisphere. We're not looking at all wealthy countries. We have large populations of Muslims, of Hindus, as well as Christians, Catholics, Protestants. It really tells us something about animal welfare, kind of defying a simple narrative that animal protection is a luxury of established democracies. So this is a particular area of interest of mine, and I'll have some publications on that if you're interested. But let me wrap up here so we have time for your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Stilt. We have a number of questions, and we'll see how much we can get to at this time. What will happen to the price of animal produce in Massachusetts as a result of the ballot measure?
Probably not very much. I mean, this was one of the arguments made against the provision by opponents. But there's a couple of realities at play here. One is that producers are moving this way anyway. If you follow the news, you'll see that corporation after corporation, McDonald's, Walmart, right? Many corporations have already tasked their suppliers with providing better welfare standards for the meat and eggs that are provided. So while this is an important measure, it is going very much along the grain of what's been happening anyway. There was a particular industry study that showed that as a result of this, eggs would increase potentially 1 cent per egg. But I think that with time, this is going to even out, as this is the way that all producers are going to go, and they will account for it as part of their production model. So I think we're going to see important benefits for animals, for consumer health and safety, with minimal to no increase in costs.
A related question, do you think that the wide support and sympathy for animals, 78% on question 3, can be used to leverage broader support for issues around climate change generally?
It's a fantastic question. I think that's absolutely right, and it's something that John Loveorn, who's here teaching wildlife law, is extremely important to him, because for many of you, who follow climate change, which was one of the most frustrating parts of it, is getting individuals to recognize it as a real and immediate issue, and not something that's going to happen a long time in the future that we'll figure out a solution for. And so the reality is, people respond to things that are tangible, and seeing polar bears on melting ice caps is very tangible in a way that talking about parts per billion of carbon dioxide is not. And so I would very much encourage, and I know that John Loveorn believes the same, the environmental groups and really everyone that cares about climate change, it's really for all of us to take every and all possible approach. And if it's talking about polar bears on ice caps that gets us to take things to heart, then we need to do that.
Thank you. Another question. How will compliance with measures such as the Massachusetts factory farming ballot measure be monitored? This question applies particularly to imported products from animals farmed abroad.
Right. So the store purchasing eggs or meat is not responsible. Right? It's the onus is on it's on the producers, right, who will have to say that they are compliant with the law. So right now the law sets up a very kind of the ballot measure, which you can look at, sets up a pretty thin regime, but these rules will start to be fleshed out with time. But the producers are going to have to say that they are the ones that are in compliance.
Is there anything we can expect from federal government and Trump administration that will impact animal rights issues?
I think there's a couple things. I mean, the Animal Welfare Act, as you saw, is not very broad in its scope. We will probably expect enforcement to continue in the sense that like with all bureaucracies, there are deep layers of administrators who are invested and tasked with carrying out the law, enforcing the law. The question will be if funding is decreased for those investigations and for those enforcement measures. Carl Icahn is a close friend of Trump and negotiated the welfare standard reforms made by McDonald's, so we might look to him as a particular individual to see if he can help be a player. But I think what's most important in many ways, and kind of going back to the climate change argument, is what happens on the environmental side. So if we pull out of the Paris talks, if we pull out of major steps and pledges made in the climate change measure, that is going to just dwarf maybe a pullback a little bit of the Animal Welfare Act enforcement. So I think we should be watching that, but we also need to be watching who comes in to head the USDA and watching in general the idea that we should be shrinking potentially if Trump goes through with this idea, we should be shrinking government overall, because that of course will affect the ability of enforcement to continue.
Professor Stilt, since you work on a constitutional animal law, could you say something about the role of judges in the development of animal law?
Judges play an important role, and I'm assuming that the question is about judges everywhere, right, everywhere in the world, and maybe in the U.S. in particular. I mean, if you look at some of these Animal Welfare Act cases, you'll see judges indicating their constraints. Right? The Animal Welfare Act does not cover a significant number of animals in context. Right? It's fairly limited in what it does cover. It does not have a citizen suit provision. Right? So standing is always a massive challenge by animal organizations. Even in the Strickland v. Medlin case that I talked about, the case in which Avery was accidentally euthanized in the shelter in Fort Worth, you really feel the judge's pain in the decision. Right? They say things like, animals are property under the law. Now, obviously, they have huge emotional attachments to humans, and the judges sort of go on to talk about that. And you really get a sense of their struggle with this idea of, as they say, animals are not property like toasters. They literally use that word, but they are still struggling with what new category might we put animals in order to give, in this case, humans more compensation for the emotional attachments that have been lost when the animal is killed. Now, I will just mention something else on the U.S. judiciary side. Stephen Wise, who as I mentioned, taught the first class in 2000, and his efforts now are on behalf of certain very highly capable animals, and primates in particular, and he's seeking to use habeas corpus to release some of these chimpanzees from conditions of confinement. And he believes that the common law, when judges are in the area realm of common law, they have more ability to expand existing protections, and habeas corpus is intended to be expansive anyway. He's hoping to capture the attention of a judge. Now, he's not succeeded yet wholesale, but he's hoping that the judges will be sympathetic and able to move in an era in which it's hard to get anything through the federal legislature, let alone increase protections for animals.
I'm troubled that we continue to use the words of ownership to describe animals. Unlike personal property, we do not have the right to do whatever we want with a pet or other animal. Is there any movement to change the vernacular about our stewardship of animals?
Absolutely, there is. I prefer a word that is not owner, personally, but you even see efforts, even at the level of state law, to change words from owners to guardians. People talk about stewardship over animals. There's definitely a shift in vocabulary that you can see even at the level of legislation sometime. The thing is, though, we also have to be mindful of the fact that while we believe that in most Americans who own pets, the vast majority would not say their pet is their quote-unquote property. They would talk about part of the family or other much more generous words, but it's important to always remind ourselves that under the law, they are property, even with certain protections that we don't give to toasters, like anti-cruelty statute, because it helps us to keep in mind what the challenges are. But absolutely, it's not an appropriate word if you're talking about how people emotionally relate to animals.
In thinking about animal rights, do you distinguish among species?
Well, it's a really important question, and so we'd have to ask, well, who's doing the thinking about rights to start with, right? So Steve Wise has a sense of a spectrum, and he's starting with the animals he believes have the most capacity for self-autonomy, for the expression of self-autonomy, most deserving of liberty interests, starting with chimpanzees as well as elephants he's currently working on, and others that he would put at that top end of the spectrum. Other philosophers talk about adult mammals as deserving of rights, so you really see many different approaches. I mean, my personal approach is to think in terms of animal protection, to think in terms of what can we do to advance the situation for as many animals as possible, and that doesn't really get us into conversations about prioritizing one particular species over the other, but rather thinking about individual needs that are species specific, and what does that animal need to thrive. It's a different way of thinking than we currently do under the law.
Another question: what types of careers are students pursuing in the animal law field?
Well, I think there's many. I think we want to think about a distinction between individuals who go to do animal law per se and those who go to firms but who want to do pro bono work in the animal law world, and that's of course an extremely important component of the career world. David Wilson, as I mentioned, a Milbank partner, has a very active animal law practice and has helped us considerably. But if we look at some recent graduates and where they've gone who want to do animal law work, there's a number of significant NGOs, the Humane Society, the Animal Legal Defense Fund, as well as environmental groups, going to be attorneys for the government or DOJ, which DOJ is a very popular place for our students. There's a lot of work to be done there, as the DOJ represents the USDA in many animal-related issues. So I think we're looking at a growth in graduates with this interest, and I think we'll be watching that as we go into the following years.
It seems so widely known now that vegan or vegetarian eating is best for the planet, for our health, and of course for animals. Why is veganism or even vegetarianism still relatively marginalized? Is it largely a matter of strong meat and dairy lobby? Is research being done regarding why the behavioral cultural shift here is so slow?
It's a good question. I think that for a long time, people thought it was a very niche personal issue. It's for your own personal health or personal preference. But now we're seeing that it's not just about that. It's about climate change. It's about questions of animal welfare. It's about human health issues. But in terms of the behavioral question itself, I think that there's new research that's coming out on it. The Good Food Institute, the speaker I showed you in one of the student slides is working specifically on that kind of research. But I think we'll start to see it becoming more and more mainstream. The Mary Robinson talk that I mentioned to you earlier at Harvard Law School, she literally said something to the effect of, people ask about being vegetarian or vegan and its effect on climate change, and that's also an important part of the conversation. So I think as we see it becoming not just a personal preference matter, but a tangible way, in fact, perhaps the most tangible way that anything that any one individual can do to help reduce methane emissions is to reduce their meat consumption. It's actually the thing that's most closely in your hands. Yes, recycling is extremely important and all the things we've always known about, but this has massive consequences, and anyone can do it starting tomorrow. We also know that there is meat reduction. There's meatless Mondays. We see data on households with meat reduction to the extent that you will notice that meat corporations are now getting into the meat alternative business. And I think if that's not a sign, that's very important to see major producers now saying, oh, we see consumer demand and we're going to move in that direction. And in fact, Tyson comes to mind as a recent one that just purchased a stake in Beyond Meat.
And our final question, in the few countries that have constitutional provisions, do any of them have statutory applications?
So that's a really important question. So Germany, for example, did what you might think is the most natural way to get to a constitutional provision, sort of from the ground up. It started with animal welfare protection at the state level, it's a federal system, and then it went to animal protection at the federal level of law, and then did it move into the Constitution in an amendment process? And it's much easier to amend the German Constitution than it is the American Constitution by multiples of 100. So that in some ways is a natural evolution. As you see, animal interests were always getting trumped by freedom of religion, freedom of the professions, because animals didn't have a constitutional hook to hang on to compete. In Egypt, it's the opposite. Because advocates had been so frustrated with the lack of the legislature moving, they went right to the Constitutional Drafting Commission when they thought there was an opportunity. In some ways, this echoes what we see on the state level in America. The Massachusetts Ballot Initiative is a voter-driven initiative, as well as other initiatives, constitutional amendments in Florida and other countries and states in which constitutional amendments are quite easy to do and come from the initiative of voters. So it's a question of strategy, and it's an interesting one.
Thanks again to Professor Stilt and to you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed today's session as much as I did. If you'd like to review any part of today's webinar, the recording of this program will be available online next week. This concludes our HLeX program for the 2016 calendar year. I hope you'll join us in the new year as we continue the open lecture series. Please stay tuned for the announcement of the lineup of faculty presenters for 2017. You can access today's recording or register for future lectures on our website, alumni.law.harvard.edu/HLeX. And be sure to fill out the short survey we email you today about the event to give us feedback to help shape future programs. Again, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.